Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We're really excited to have Dr. Celia Fisher and Meg Garvin making the presentation today. The focus will be ethical implications of developing and piloting a victimization screening tool for children and youth. I do want to let you know that we've had several conversations with both of the presenters over the last couple of months. So they have a pretty good handle as to where both the Virginia and the Montana team lie right now. This is a webinar, so both will be presenting information or presenting different perspectives. Meg will be coming in to talk a lot about a victim perspective, so I think you'll find that interesting. But slightly different than some of our other webinars, we will be unmuting everybody on a phone line, and so we'd like this to be a dialogue and for you to be able to ask questions whenever something is confusing or when it really sparks an idea too. So if Celia or Meg bring something up and you want more information about, well, how could we really apply it in our local area, please feel free to ask those questions. I think that is all we have right now. If you have any questions for us, please type them in the chat box, and Alicia and I will be able to help you if there are any technical difficulties. But I think we should probably get started. Alicia, would you mind moving to the next slide for me? Before Dr. Fisher and Meg come on, I'm going to introduce Bethany for some quick caveats having to do with OVC. So Bethany, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Carlene. And hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. We have a few caveats that we just wanted to get out of the way very quickly. We wanted to let you know that if you have questions and you need any clarification about how today's webinar or the content impacts your grant, ask your OVC grant manager. OVC has a very narrow interpretation of research versus evaluation, and our attorneys within DOJ are responsible for providing us interpretations of all the federal statutes that will apply to our work, and they have interpreted the scope of your work that you're doing through the demonstration projects and through the evaluations of the screening tools, that they have determined that you are doing evaluations. They do not believe you are doing research. And one of the reasons that we reinforce this is because OVC funds cannot support research. The VOCA statute, which is the federal law that guides what we can and can't pay for, that does not allow us to fund research. So you are doing evaluation, according to our attorneys. If you're wondering about what are your requirements associated with those federal statutes that apply to that, look in your special conditions. That's what it's for. So you have two special conditions already in your award document. And so check those out and talk with your OVC grant manager if you have any questions. So I'll turn it back over to you, Carlene.
Okay, thank you, Bethany. So everybody, we are slowly working on unmuting everybody right now. Would you mind switching slides for me, Alicia? Okay, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Fisher. Thank you so much for this presentation today. We look forward from hearing from you.
Okay, it's my pleasure. Hello to everybody. And the way I've structured this webinar is based on review of the materials and discussions with Carlene and other individuals. I've kind of structured it in terms of the types of questions, ethical questions, that sites should be asking, rather than coming up with the answer to those questions, although we can certainly discuss that. But given the variability of the sites, the places in which participants and clients will be evaluated, and that diversity, the answers are going to be very contextual to these kinds of questions. So, I'm happy to discuss details when you bring them up. So I've divided this webinar into 5 different topics. The first one is how it's really focusing on when you're doing the recruitment and the informed consent for participation in this evaluation. And the first part of it focuses on how to ensure that participation is voluntary. The second section will be talking about what are the risks and benefits of referral procedures that are based on using a screening tool that has yet to be validated. The third section will be on issues regarding protection of confidentiality and then sharing of information when, in fact, a child may be in jeopardy. The fourth is on crisis management and mandated reporting. And the last one is on the key elements of informed consent. Okay, so getting to the first topic, this is the question of when we are doing evaluations on site, what are the issues that are involved in ensuring that participation is voluntary? And voluntariness is particularly critical when one is working with vulnerable populations and populations that are vulnerable to coercion and undue influence. Now, the reason why the populations that you'll be working with are more vulnerable to coercion and undue influence is because they either need the services that are going to be provided or they recognize that there are legal consequences for perhaps some of the comments that they will or will not make. And so in that sense, your populations are vulnerable to challenges to voluntary participation. So I call the context in which you are going to be operating service delivery settings, they may not all be phrased like that, but I wasn't sure what kind of title would subsume all the different contexts in which you work. So one of the first questions to ask yourself is, does the participant or consumer or client or however you categorize people tools, do they understand the difference between a screening tool and service delivery? So when, in fact, you're evaluating a screening tool, it means that you don't know yet if any of the answers to the questions can be helpful, can have utility both in terms of services that might be needed or reporting that may be required. That's different from a service delivery tool. And so one of the issues is, does the person who's agreeing to participate in this evaluation understand the limitations of the screening tool that's going to be used? Another issue that has to do with voluntariness. Now, the reason, of course, that first one has to do with voluntariness is if they think that this is a standard service delivery distinction, that they may be more eager to participate. The next thing is, do they understand the differential role of someone who is serving as giving this new tool as part of an evaluation of the tool itself versus someone who is there to deliver assessment services? Now, it may end up that it's the same exact person that is doing this at the site, except that their roles are going to be very different. Because in one, they're really serving the needs of the institution in terms of validating an instrument, whereas if they are in their service role, they are also serving the needs of the children. Another issue has to do with fear of punitive action if participation is refused. Now, I know that, of course, in the consent or other ways that you get agreement, it has that sentence that says there won't be any punishment, it's voluntary. But the point of the matter is, if you put yourself in the client or consumer or participant's shoes or the test taker's shoes, they probably don't really believe that if they're just reading it. And so one of the things is, how are you going to clarify for them that, in fact, their participation in this aspect of an assessment that may be going on anyway, but in their answering questions related to this tool, that, in fact, services aren't going to be denied, or they're going to be punished in some way later on. And also they need to understand what are the consequences of excluding participants. I know that, for example, one of the exclusion criteria, I believe, is whether or not the child's in foster care. It's very important to help them understand that this is not a punishment. It's not that it's negative that they're being excluded. It's really for the purposes of having some kind of uniform population for the evaluation itself. So those are things to consider. Okay, so now I want to talk a little bit more about the importance of the evaluation service distinction. So one of the issues is when you're describing the screening tool evaluation, are you doing it in language that the participant actually understands? Do they have any idea what a tool means, or even what an assessment is, or what an evaluation is? Because those terms may be very unfamiliar to them, and you may or may not. You're not using the word research, but you are doing an analysis of a tool. And so you have to make sure they understand this distinction. The next thing that has to do with voluntary participation is where this takes place. Where does the recruitment and consent take place? Is it in a very public area of the service delivery or institutional context in which these people are arriving for another reason? How many staff are around when they agree to or refuse to participate? What does that mean in terms of their understanding of how voluntary this is, or whether or not the rest of the staff is going to look at them in a negative way? In addition, are there other clients around who are going to see whether or not they are volunteering to be in this kind of assessment? Because one of the risks of this assessment is that they're asked questions about other people in the neighborhood. Is the child bullied? Has the child heard gunshots in the neighborhood? Things like that. So if in fact it's a public waiting room or something like that where they're approached, then you really want to be considering whether or not there's any risks to them involved in that. Now, in what I've seen of the informed consent is that one of the benefits that are cited is that they might have access to referral services that they would not otherwise have. Now, once again, just saying that, if they're only being given the evaluation, the tool that's being evaluated, that can be somewhat blur the lines between the use of valid delivery tools versus you're trying to assess this kind of new tool. And so it might also change whether or not they want to participate, and you want to make sure that they understand that any referrals based upon this yet to be evaluated tools does not have the same confidence, that your service providers do not have the same confidence in the referral that might be made as they would with other tools. Okay, and then another part of this has to do with the staff responsibilities. So I'm assuming that you're not hiring, or maybe you are. I don't really know. But if you're using staff who have other responsibilities at the organizations in which this testing is going to be conducted, you have to think about who is the staff that's actually recruiting and consenting. Do these staff also provide services in other contexts to these participants, so that there is this kind of, oh, I like, Miss X because, or I'm afraid of of disappointing Miss X, and now she's asking me to be in this evaluation study, I better say yes. So you really want to think about how, if there are these dual roles, the extent to which one has, that you've communicated to the staff who's doing it what their distinctive roles are, and the ways in which this staff can actually communicate to the people they're asking to be in it, how their roles are separated. And one of the challenges of this is, if you're using staff that will also do other assessments and evaluations of the participants, how are you separating out what they learn from this tool from what they learn in more standardized assessments? So how are they going to maintain, in some sense you have to ignore what this tool is telling you. You have to take it into account, but you can't use it as something that is as valid as some of the other instruments that you've used. And how is the staff, who may see these clients again or have seen them before, separate out the knowledge they're gaining from this tool from the knowledge that they need to gain from other validated assessment instruments and interview processes or other kinds of things that are normally done at the site. And so I think I mentioned this before, but when simply saying you're not going to be punished for this, you're not going to have a discontinuation of services, may not be sufficient. I'm sure there's a diversity, clearly there's a diversity in age, and how you convince a young child, who's assenting and, an adolescence, that in fact there's not going to be negative consequences to saying no, or their parents, you really want to make sure that language is fitted, even if it's not the written part of that consent, but how the people that are doing the recruitment and the consent are tailoring their language to the needs, hopes, and fears and understandings of those who are being asked to participate. Okay, and I think I've already said that. And sometimes I found it helpful to give people a way they can refuse. So for many of the sites, there's an informed consent, there's a check at the end, and they agree that they will participate, and they understand that by agreeing to participate, they can be subject to reporting if so needed, and referrals. But that's just a check. For some of these people, the kids or some of their parents who maybe lack reading skills and lack of education, you might want to think about clearer ways, that you can just say no if you don't want to participate. You're going to, there's a checklist that obviously we have to fill out, this form, but you can also, before you even check this, let me know yes or no, do you want to participate? I thought it was very nice, at least in the consent forms that I've seen, the drafts, that people are allowed to take this home and think about it. What I didn't see, and I think it's always important, is to stop and say, do you have questions? And sometimes, especially with low literacy populations or with child populations, it's good to stop after major sections of the consent rather than say at the end, do you have any questions? But, when you've explained what it's for, you can say, do you have any questions? When you explain the confidentiality issues, do you have any questions? Things like that. Okay, and I think this may be the last slide on voluntarism. So I think we already talked about this, the public-private considerations. The other thing I was thinking about is you might have variability in whether or not this is the first time a client and their child has come to the service setting. And their familiarity with what you're doing and the difference between an evaluation and their normal assessment may be very different from somebody who's been coming for several months or weeks or a year. So you really want to consider for those people, this is their first day or their first time, what this means to them. And it may require a lot more explanation to ensure that they understand their participation in the evaluation part is voluntary. And I think I already talked about how, explaining inclusion and exclusion is very important so they don't feel they failed something if they're not included. Okay, so are there any questions about that? Because I'm going to go into the risks and benefits of participation.
This is Meg. May I chime in with just a couple of points?
Sure.
Which I know some will be covered in more depth by Dr. Fisher later, but I just wanted to flag, so this is Meg Garvin, and I work with victims of crime who may be presenting themselves to you, as you all know. And so on the slides that Dr. Fisher just went through, 3 points jumped out to me that I wanted to flag. The first is, as she noted, right, many of the folks that you may be presenting themselves to you are vulnerable in a myriad of ways. But I wanted to flag that, of course, one of those ways is their victimization that you may uncover through these evaluative tools. And so just knowing that the very population that the tool may help you identify to provide referrals about has vulnerabilities because of the things that the tool might help you get at. And so I just wanted to really flag that because that goes to their voluntariness, right? They've been in power differential situations, and now you're using an evaluation tool that might result in services or not services or particular referrals. So I just wanted to flag, right, the trauma history of some of the folks is itself a vulnerability. So I just wanted to flag that because it goes to the voluntariness. The second thing is on slide 7 where the discussion was about staff responsibilities. I know that Dr. Fisher is going to speak about this later, but I wanted to flag it here also, which is if a staff is serving in dual roles, understanding whether their access to confidentiality and privilege protections and or mandatory reporting obligations carry with them into different roles, meaning do they carry with them because of their profession, or are they situation specific, those benefits and protections and obligations is a really important analysis point to know whether they're the right person to be deploying the evaluation tool. So I know we're going to talk about mandatory reporting later, but in light of it coming up here of dual roles, I wanted to flag it. And the last point is on in working with survivors a lot, one of the things that I have found particularly useful is, as Dr. Fisher noted, when you pause to ask, are there questions as you're going through and pausing at particular moments. Sometimes with survivors who may be having a difficult time processing information because they might have disassociated in the moment or some other thing has happened, instead of just asking, do you have questions, at particularly poignant moments, including their understanding of whether they have to participate, need to participate, can stop at any time. Instead of just asking, do you have questions, asking them to explain to you what they understand of what you said. And so sometimes they'll explain back to you that, in fact, they don't think they can terminate an interview. And so then going back over that information with them. So an active response as opposed to asking an open-ended question, asking them to respond back to you how they understood what you just told them can be very beneficial. Those were the 3 points I wanted to make.
I think those are great points, and if we don't have time, I wanna underscore what Meg talked about. What I realized was, as you were talking, that this is the most direct questions that they may get about whether or not they've been victimized, and number one, that may be stressful and traumatic. Number two, they may not have come there for the first time to let you know about that, or they may be feeling out the agency about that, or not understanding the repercussions. And so the fact that this scale, because when I looked at the informed consent, it's talking about victimization, but you might want to think about whether or not, how clearly do you want to say this is really asking you, especially those kids, the extent to which you have been victimized. This is going to be asking, you parent, how your child has been victimized. So I think those were great points to keep in mind. So I'm not going to slide 10. I'm just going to skip because it's kind of obvious. But so one of the risks and benefits of this school, one of the issues I know that a lot of the sites will be grappling with, in fact, if they have mandatory reporters who are actually doing this assessment, is what do you do if it looks like the child has been sexually abused? And so I think with that screening tool, one of the things you need to be looking at is, are the items that are going to be used as evidence for mandatory reporting, do they actually match the legal language of the statutes in the state? Because a risk of an unvalidated tool is over or underestimation. So I think that's something very important that you want to do. And that's keeping in mind the notion that if this is the first time that a family or children have been asked about victimization, what are the risks of underestimating that for the family? And maybe they'll never come back again because they feel that you just didn't get it. And what are the risks of overestimating, which means, legal issues, child protection services. And so as you're evaluating how you're going to approach referrals and reporting based upon that scale, you need to be thinking about how valid each of those items are, or the scoring system is, to make that kind of a referral. So do not assume that referrals or reporting based on that unvalidated tool is always a benefit. I guess that's the kind of things one should be thinking about. One of the things to think about is the scoring system. This is a new tool. How you score it, whether it's simply adding up 2 items in one of the sections, you have to think about, once again, because there are risks of underestimating and overestimating victimization. So are the items clear to the people that are responding to them in terms of the level of harm? So for example, has a child been in a place where they're exposed to gunshots? Well, somebody could be in their apartment and hear gunshots outside. That's probably not what you're trying to get at in that scale. What you're trying to get at is, have they been in the presence of gunshot where they felt that they or their child was in harm's way? And so you want to be looking at every one of those items to make sure that if you're going to be using them as a measure of victimization, that what you think is in that item is very, very clear to the person that's responding to it. You also want to look at, if you're adding up items, are they equivalent in harm? Is bullying, for example, by peers equivalent to being sexually, victimized, which some of the questions refer to? So, you want to look at whether or not scoring that's just based on checking two different items is really going to get to the level of harm, can differentiate levels of harm that those items may actually indicate. Similarly, the mental health items are very variable in terms of what they might mean in terms of a mental health disorder. So, trouble concentrating in light of a victimization episode may be very different if the child was bullied the day before versus the child has been the victim of sexual coercion from a family member. So, and clearly trouble concentrating has less of a immediacy value than tried to hurt him or herself. So once again, simply scoring on the basis of how many items are checked may not be sufficient in terms of how the instrument is used for identifying victimization. And one has to look at, there was a lot of items on sexual coercion. And so what does that mean if because it could be the same act that's being described. So these are just some things you want to think about in terms of the items themselves. Population generalizability has to do with whether or not the item is understood the same by children, adolescents, and parents. Does it have the same meaning to them? And that's important to try to figure out. Also, whether or not there are different economic ways of looking. For example, I think one of the questions was going to bed without dinner. If you're very poor, that might happen 1 or 2 days. So the question is that neglect? Is that victimization? Does it have different meanings? Is there going to be an overestimation of victimization for some families that are homeless or something like that? Now, maybe that's appropriate for the way you want to define this, but you just want to be thinking about that. And clearly, you also want to think about whether, I know that you're using English language only populations, but there still may be cultural differences in how groups are interpreting the wording that's being used. Yeah, so I just want to point out, by the way, just because somebody can speak English doesn't mean they're proficient in English. And so that's really important for bilingual populations that you're going to be working with to make sure, like sexual coercion, does that, do they really understand what that word means? Okay, so Meg, do you want to say anything or?
No, not on this section. Thank you.
Okay, so now I'm going to talk about challenges in making referral. One of the things is when you're using a tool that hasn't been evaluated, another thing is to think about, I think it's a wonderful idea to give families referral to services for them. And I think in some instances you may be making the referral themselves. But what if you're overestimating a child's mental health, reactions, their despondency or anxiety or level of stress? What does that mean to the family? Who now thinks that their child has a mental health problem. So it's a caveat that has to be considered when one is making a referral based on a tool that has not yet been validated. I think we talked about already how the nature of the referral is determined. And I don't know yet if each site has thought through how are you connecting the items with the specific service that's going to be recommended. I'm sure that will vary across sites, but when you're training the staff who are going to be doing these evaluations, they have to have a clear understanding of which items are associated with what kind of referral. And by the way, whether or not the family uses the referral can also be a way of validating the usefulness of the instrument, and that's just something you might want to think about. Okay, yeah, and so part of that is don't try to be as standardized as you can and not allow for kind of the clinical interpretation of the evaluator themselves to make the appropriate referral, because that will hurt in terms of the extent to which the tool is actually validated. Okay, so now I'm going to start talking about the confidentiality risks. Obviously, you're clearly more familiar with them than I am in terms of working with these very vulnerable populations. Once again, confidentiality has to do with how are the individuals identified. Are some identified because they've already been identified as victims of some of these issues? How is the data that's collected from the unvalidated tool going to be separated in the records from, if you're also using instruments, from validated tools? Because that's a big confidentiality issue. Should staff have access to responses on a tool that's not yet validated? And does that risk over or underestimating victimization and actually violating confidentiality? I wasn't sure whether or not administrative records were also being used, and if so, Meg would have more of this than I, but what kind of permission do you have to get in order to say, we're going to see whether or not the scale, a lot of times when you're trying to validate an instrument, you look at whether or not responses to the new tool are related to previous interviews or assessments that have been done, legal court cases that may be in the records, future legal steps that have been taken with these families. So, you have to know whether or not you also need their approval to use information that's already in their records. I'm less familiar with the type of records that you keep. I'm more familiar with a HIPAA authorization, which would have to be gotten if it was a healthcare setting and you wanted to relate a tool to a healthcare record. You'd have to get a specific written authorization. You may have something similar or not for your administrative records.
Dr. Fisher, this is Carlene. Could I interrupt you really quickly? Nikki Camp from Montana posed a really good question. Nikki, if you could unmute yourself, would you mind asking Celia your question directly?
Yeah, sure. So this is back when you were talking about the weight of the questions. And I understand what you're saying, and we fought with this in Montana quite a bit. But it occurred to us, our state told us, that really the only path for kids with identified need anymore in our state is through mental health. So with that in mind, our priority has become identifying need regardless of what kind it is, because we're not going to send a child that's been witnessed domestic violence to a different place than we're going to send a child that has been sexually assaulted. It's unfortunate. I wish we had more avenues, but we really don't. So our priority has become just identifying need and then getting that kid to the next step so they can have the more in-depth assessment. So we haven't really assigned weights necessarily to our questions. We're still, wrestling with which questions are every kid probably going to answer yes to, how can we reword them, those types of things. But I just was curious if that makes sense, if there's something I might be missing. I just want to get your thoughts.
Well, I have two thoughts, and I think that's a great question. One thought is, as I understand it, the kids are not going to be asked the mental health questions unless they checked one of the victimization items. Is that?
Yeah, that's true. Mental health would be the folks that would really delve into a more in-depth assessment of either trauma or victimization or mental health.
But in other words, if on the first page they don't answer any of those questions, on victimization, they're not even asked mental health questions?
That's correct.
Okay, so that's one thing. Obviously, so there is some relationship, but I guess your question is, so you're going to try to make as many referrals as possible in a more global sense. You really want to get them for further screening, is what you're saying, that this is, or further assessment, that you're using this as kind of a low-level screening tool to get kids who may or may not need it into a better assessment or better services. And so what, and I understand that, and I think that is a positive, a plus for the families. I guess what I would say for the informed consent, what's important is to let them know that this is just a screen, and that it doesn't mean their kid has a mental health problem. It doesn't mean their kid has a learning disorder, but that this provides an opening, since there was a yes, to further evaluate this.
Okay. Yeah, we're really looking for kids that, it sounds terrible, but the most victimized kids that don't have access to maybe a physician asking them those questions. So that's what we're after. We're trying to set our threshold so that we aren't sending every kid, but that we are still sending kids that have needs. So that's helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, you know, it also raises in my mind another issue, that when you make this referral, given you don't know if the kid's been victimized or at what level the child's victimized, I think you want to be very careful in terms of what you submit to the practitioner you're referring this to, or mental health services, so that it's not, in other words, you could say they took a victimization scale and they indicated this kind of distress, and all of a sudden it's like the telephone game, that, you know, the next service provider says this is a victim of abuse, or this child's been subject to victimization. So be very careful in how you write the referral, or what instruments or any kind of report that practitioner is going to get, so that you're not creating, you know, kind of like an assumption that the kid's been victimized.
Okay.
And may I jump in on that? This is Meg. Not only the assumption of what the victimization is or was, but also what it's not. And what I mean by that is, right, if there is victimization, if this all ends up landing somewhere in court downstream,
Right.
And what is identified early on is, let's say, physical child abuse. And along this referral path, that's what everyone starts to name it. And then later the child says it was sexual. Then that child's going to be subject to horrible cross-examination during the legal process, because someone's going to say they changed their story. So the labels that we as referral folks and clinicians and evaluators put on things early on, if we are narrow or we choose a name of something that's useful to us as we're creating the referral process, but doesn't align with what the child's actual experience is or what becomes litigated, we've created challenges for them. So just a note of caution about whatever labels we put on things, saying things that it's indicative of X but not exclusive of other things. That's useful language. All of that just so that there's not a cross-examination moment about a change of story, which we know results in re-traumatization. Right.
And you might use, I don't know what your referrals are going to look like, but you could say, you know, in evaluating a potential screening tool, there was some indication the child may have been victimized. Follow up on stress indicated this, and therefore we're referring to you. But you know, you can be vague in that manner if that's appropriate, and if it gets them the services, because I do understand the bind that you were talking about. Okay, so all right, so we already talked about that. Okay, so I think we basically talked about this, because I did notice in some of the instructions, you know, about crisis intervention. So what happens is, if you do crisis intervention as part of a tool that's yet to be evaluated, does the crisis intervention now go into the child or family's administrative record? So Meg, I think this really has to do with what Meg was just talking about, but have to be very, very careful there in terms of having some kind of uniform way that those people that are doing the interviews are going to define what a crisis intervention is and what is going to be put into that administrative record without labeling that child as the victim of a specific type of crime, bullying, or other violent act. So I think that adds a level of complexity when you're doing what you feel needs to be done to protect that child, but it may have administrative consequences. Okay, so that's pretty much saying the same thing. I think we've already talked about that. Oh, the other thing is that I don't know, every state and locality operates differently, but if for some reason there is, it meets a threshold for mandated reporting, then just make sure that who's ever doing the interview understands the processes. I know in some states or localities, you encourage the parents also to be involved in the reporting to the agency because that often works better for them if they are involved as well as the mandated reporter. So, I think that these things really need to be spelled out for the staff. It shouldn't, especially when you're using an unvalidated tool, it shouldn't simply be left up to each interviewer's typical way of responding to these issues. And that's what that last item was really getting at. Meg, did you want to say anything about that?
No, I think I agree with everything you just said. I think this is a moment just to ensure also that that there's a little training in advance of the folks who are going to be deploying the tool on mandatory reporting and really actually, right, mandatory reporting laws are incredibly complex in each jurisdiction. And so having someone train on that rather than assume an answer to it would be really useful for each location, for anyone who's going to be using the tool so that there's some clarity.
Great. Okay, so now we're getting to the last part, which is informed consent. So informed consent really has three components. One is, are participants given all the information that they need to make a reasoned choice about whether or not they want to participate? And do they understand the consequences of their participation? So one is you presented the information. The other is, do they really understand how it's going to pertain to them? What are the risks and benefits of their own participation? So what are the key elements of informed consent? Once again, we've gone over this. How clear are you about the fact that this is a tool that we don't know the validity of, that they're helping to create such a tool that would be helpful to others in the future? How long it's expected to take, which, I'm sure you're doing, what the procedures are, and which procedures are, I use the word experimental, but it probably should be evaluative here, but I think some sites are going to be using this tool in addition to other tools that are being used that are already standardized. So explaining to them that which part of it is the part that they can say no to because this is the part that's just the evaluation study part. So I think that if you're using a battery, that has to be made clear to them. The foreseeable risks and discomforts, obviously confidentiality and reporting are the biggest risks that need to be emphasized. I'm not sure, I think that the traumatic aspect of this may not have been as well thought out in the informed consent part, because if you're asking, and this may be the first time a child has revealed to somebody that they've been a victim, It can be very, very upsetting, and I know that this is where the crisis intervention comes in. This is where you can stop, but, perhaps warn it, a little more discussion about the emotionality that may accompany answering some of these questions, tailored to who you're talking to, might be helpful. Now, also, usually, if they're coming in for an assessment anyway, it's very important in the informed consent so they know it really is voluntary to say, you're going to still get all these other assessments. We're just asking you to agree to this one other evaluation tool that's only going to take maybe, 20 minutes, but will be very helpful to us in the future. So that's what I meant by that bullet. Okay, and I guess these documents are not going to be de-identified, but one of the things you need to think about when you're working with, I guess, Jared or any other researcher, is the researcher going to get the names of these people? Is everything, de-identified? That wasn't in the informed consent, and I don't know if that's been thought through, but I don't see any reason why the investigator who's at a university should have access to these people's names. Or any other identifying information that's not age or, socioeconomic class or anything else you think might be relevant to the tool itself. So I think you probably thought that through for your IRB proposals, but I just wanted to remind you. Okay, we already talked about the voluntary nature. We talked about English proficiency, reading level, explaining the difference between an evaluation tool and a comprehensive assessment. Just be thinking about the increased opportunity for you to access services. Now, that may or may not be true because I think just that sentence alone, it sounds like if there's no victimization, then they're not going to get questions that will be helpful to them as accessing services. So once again, that statement might be clarified a little bit. And this is just what I meant by this. I know I'm trying to make sure we have time for questions. Now, therapeutic misconception, what that means is that participants confuse the role of the person conducting an evaluation of a screening tool with the role of service provider. So I didn't see that in the informed consent. I already talked about that in terms of voluntary participation, but I think it really needs to be clear what the distinctive roles of this individual is going to be. Okay, so I don't think in the informed consent it was that clear that the instrument is going to ask them who perpetrated the victimization, because that's something they may not want to be answering those questions. And this is an evaluation. This is a tool that's being evaluated. It may be fine in some other things, but that. Just think about whether or not someone can make a reasoned decision about whether or not they want to participate. Does the child coming in understand that they may have to identify a parent or a family member in terms of using drugs in front of them or something like that? So I'm not sure that's clear in the way the informed consent is now developed. I also think there is a risk to family cohesion here that I'm just wondering whether, once again, if reporting is going to be required, is there something to, I don't know what your usual steps are, but if there's abuse and the kid has to be taken out of the home, are they going to be assisted with those services? So anyhow, it's just something to think about depending on how you decide to do your referrals and reporting. And I think we've talked about this, so I'm not going to go into it. You just want to make sure that they understand in the beginning, not just at the end, that they are agreeing, in answering these questions, they are agreeing that you can refer them to a service, give their name to a service setting, and you can use your mandatory reporting. And I think it's very important that you make that clear during the consent, not just at the end when they're checking a box that says, yes, I understand you can report me, and I can only participate if I agree to that. So I think it's really important to clarify that. Okay. And I think we talked about this already. Do you need authorization for administrative records? The other thing is, it wasn't clear, and you might want to think through, what information do you share with parents from the child's reports? That wasn't as clear, and how you are going to share it. So not only do you want to obviously have the assents written at the right developmental level, but you want to be able to explain to both the parent and the child what will or will not be shared. And number two, if the child says, I don't want to participate, but the parent says, I want them to participate, does the child's dissent override guardian permission? I don't know if you have a policy on that. Typically, in research, in regulations for research itself, typically child dissent overrides guardian permission for anything that isn't going to provide a treatment for the child that's not otherwise available. But since this is an evaluation, that's something that you have to decide, but I didn't see it was formalized anywhere. And I already discussed this in terms of what information is or is not going to be shared. You're going to tell parents if the child said, yes, I've been bullied, or yes, I've heard gunshots, and what the consequences are of that. In a clinical setting, typically one encourages the child to tell the parent about these experiences. How is it going to be handled in this particular evaluation setting? And then, I think we've already talked about the importance of procedures for allowing them to answer questions. So I will then leave it open to other questions.
This is Meg. If I may, just 2 points as people are getting ready to ask their questions. I know we're close on time. One, the discussion about what information goes to kind of the person evaluating the tool and not, I would say be very cautious, and I'm sure everyone is, about what information goes there that's identifiable, because as soon as there is a repository of information about someone's victimization, that's where subpoenas will start to be directed if a case moves through criminal or civil court or family law. So everywhere that there is repository of information about the story that comes at issue in the justice system, that's where people point subpoenas. So clarity of knowing who has which information and separating all of it out as much as possible, that will be as protective of victims as you can get. And so just want to flag that and have that really documented also, that people don't have identifiable information, because then you also won't have to fight a subpoena, right? It'll just be clear from your policy. And then the second point, and my last point I just wanted to flag here, is in the process of collecting this information in order to provide referrals, you may in fact be discovering that folks are victims who have rights, right? In certain jurisdictions, the rights attach to them even before there is a criminal prosecution. It's upon incident. Montana has a very untested new constitutional amendment called Marcy's Law that passed last November, That's very broad, and so understanding how that interplays with does the child have certain rights, does the parent have certain rights, particularly with regard to privacy, is just something to overlay in all of this also, just have at least thought it through. It's untested. There's no case law explaining what it means. It's just make sure you've thought about it so your policies factor it as best you can at this juncture.
Well, thank you guys. We're running short on time, but we still do have some extra time. If anybody has some questions for either of our presenters, both the Montana and the Virginia team. Another thing that I want to pose to everybody is that we can, if you want private TA calls with either Dr. Fisher or with Meg, the National Council can help you with that. We can set something up if you want to talk about specifically what's been going on in your local jurisdiction. So please keep that in mind for the future. It doesn't look like anybody has any questions, so I'm not going to hold anybody. Bethany, would you like to say anything before we close down? All right. All right. Well, thank you so much to Meg and Dr. Fisher. We really appreciate sorry, Bethany is typing in a quick message. We really appreciate everybody for joining the call today, and we will talk to you soon. Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.